Welcome to your U.S. Industrialization Lecture. U.S. industrialization occurred from the latter part of the 1800s to the early part of the 1900s. Prior to U.S. industrialization, there was something called the Market Revolution. The Market Revolution included changes in transportation and the emergence of factories. In this lecture, I want you to be able to describe social and economic life during the Industrial Revolution, industrialization's impact on American society, and factors that contributed to the explosive industrial growth in the U.S. By 1880, the majority of workers were in non-farming jobs. Two-thirds of Americans were wage earners instead of owning a farm. And by 1913, the U.S. produced one-third of the world's industrial output. So what made it possible was the railroads. The number of railroad tracks tripled between the 1860s and 1880 and tripled again in 1920. And you can see this increase in this chart. You can also see the increase in this chart of the United States. All of these squiggly lines are railroads. There were explosive economic growth causes. The first was an abundance of natural resources, specifically coal and iron. The federal government promoted industrial and agricultural development, innovations, the availability of capital for investment, the expanding market manufactured goods, and immigration increase. Let's talk about natural resource abundance first. As you can see from this chart, coal increases quite a bit from 1820 to 1900. And what coal was used for was railroads. Railroads were steamed by, or ran on steam, which was produced by coal and water. So all of those railroad tracks that you saw, coal was very instrumental in helping those, of course, move along. We had also an increase in iron between 1840 and 1900. And iron, like coal, was needed for railroads, except it was needed for railroad tracks. One characteristic of iron is that it can hold heat very well, and it's very sturdy. So that's very good for railroad tracks, because that's what you need, is sturdiness and something that can withstand heat. If you look at these two charts, you can see that the amount of coal used increased extensively by the time you reach 1900. In 1850, it was primarily animal power sources such as oxen, horses, etc. And then by the time you get to the 1900s, it is primarily coal and steam. All right, so another reason for industrial growth was that the federal government promoted industrial and agricultural development. First, they implemented high tariffs. Tariffs are simply taxes on imported goods. And what the intent of tariffs is to promote domestic growth. In other words, to encourage consumers to buy goods locally. Because when you have a tariff on an import, that makes the cost of that import very high. So the intention is to promote domestic growth. The federal government will also issue lands for railroads. And it also will be instrumental in removing Indians from Western lands. This had actually been going on for quite some time during the early 1800s and into the late 1800s. And by the time we reached the late 1800s, Indians were living on reservations. All right, let's move on to innovations. First innovation I want to talk about is the telegraph. The telegraph helped improve communications, particularly between the eastern part of the country and the western part of the country. Prior to this, what we had was letters that oftentimes could take days or months to send a letter or a communication to someone from the East Coast, from someone to the east, from the East Coast to someone on the western side of the country. So it improved communications, not just personal communications, but business communications, newspapers, the goings on of current events, and so forth. One of the ways it improves business communications is that it allows contracts to be typed up quickly. And the way the telegraph worked was that you would have a telegraph operator in, say, a town on the eastern side of the United States, and then you'd have a telegraph operator in somewhere in the western United States. And the one in the eastern United States would use Morse code to transfer a message or a letter or some sort of communication to an operator who would on the western side of the U.S., and that person would receive that message and then, of course, give it to the recipient of that message. So it really improves communications, both business, newspaper, and so forth. The telephone. The telephone really did the same type of thing as the telegraph did, except better. The telephone, you could actually speak into a device and someone could receive that. So instead of typing a message, you could actually speak to someone. So it worked kind of in the same way that the telegraph did, except you didn't need Morse code. And both the telegraph and the telephone would run across a wire. So you used to have things called telephone wires back when I was growing up. I think they actually put them in the ground now, but when I was growing up, you had them on posts and you could see them everywhere. So the telephone greatly improves communication. You have the typewriter. Typewriter also helps improve communication because you can type faster than you can write, or most people can. And I know some of this might be very new to you. Some of you maybe never have even seen a typewriter. But before there were computers, there were typewriters. Another thing that the typewriter did was to help, or was to create a new type of role in society called the secretary. So for all of you secretaries out there, you have the typewriter to thank for your position. You also had the handheld camera. And what was nice about the handheld camera is that you could take pictures in different places, or it was easier to take pictures in different places and from different angles. Because before what you had were these big, bulky cameras that sat on tripods and that were very difficult to move around, so you couldn't get shots very easily. So this greatly improved that, the types of shots you could get. It really improved the photography profession quite a bit. You also had the moving camera, which will create a new industry called the entertainment industry or the movie industry, which will create roles such as actors, actresses, directors, producers, and so forth. And the moving camera is that you could, as the name suggests, take pictures of someone moving and eventually talking. But at first they're silent films, and then there will be talking films. But what that does is it creates a reason for people to go to a theater. So it creates movie theaters, which changes society because now people are moving from their homes and meeting up at movie theaters. So it improves, but changes the way society interacts with each other. Then you will have something called the Bessemer process. The Bessemer process is the process that is used to make steel. So we have a new type of element to use. So for the most part, I don't say that it takes place of iron, but it really improves upon having just iron. Because the problem with iron is that it is stiff, it doesn't move, whereas steel is malleable, or it can move. So if you want to build a large building, such as a skyscraper, then you could use steel, because steel could withstand the wind speed, and it could move, whereas iron couldn't. And so you couldn't make very tall buildings with iron. And steel could also withstand heat as well. Then you had the phonograph. The phonograph is what I would call an early record player, but most of you probably don't even know what a record player is. Used to have these little discs that you put on record players, and it played music. But what the phonograph did is it helped improve entertainment. It helped improve social circles. And so instead of going to see a band at a local venue, then they could just record their music, and then you could listen to it at home, or you could take it to a dance hall and invite people and have a dance, right? So it improves the entertainment industry, and improves and changes the way, I'm saying again, not improves, but changes the way society interacts with one another. And of course the big one, which was electricity. Electricity really just changed everything. Prior to electricity, you saw the power sources that we talked about before. We also used oil and lamps, and prior to that we used candles to light houses or light businesses. But now things could stay open, businesses could stay open longer, factories could work their people longer, you could stay up longer. You didn't necessarily go to bed when it was dark, because one of the reasons people went to bed when it was dark is because you didn't have a lot of light, or you didn't have any light except for maybe a candle or an oil burning lamp. So electricity dramatically changes society. Can you imagine a world without electricity? And electricity was more reliable than steam or water power, or any other type of power that we had up until that point. Then I mentioned earlier the skyscraper. Because of steel, we're able to have skyscrapers. And what skyscrapers do is they change the city landscape, right? So you see these big giant buildings that you didn't, if you look at city landscapes prior to the 1800s or late 1800s, they look much different. And the skyscrapers created a need for elevators. This is a pull elevator, and then later on we will have more of the type of electric cable elevators that we have now. So you can see how one invention drives the other one. So we had the invention of steel, which allowed for skyscrapers, and then skyscrapers created a need for elevators. And you don't want to walk up and down these skyscrapers if they're too high up, nor do you want to transport goods upstairs either. So it was a major invention. All right, we'll talk about the availability of capital for investment and the expanding market for manufacturing goods. I'm just going to touch on these briefly. The reason we have industrial growth is because we have more capital to invest in it. And also the reason for industrial growth is that we have an expanding market of manufacturing goods. So we've created markets. I just described how each type of invention created a market for the other one. So we have this expanding market for manufacturing goods. Another industrial growth factor was immigration increase. The U.S. government promoted immigration. With all of this industrialization going, with the factories and the railroads and such, it needed workers to to help build the railroads, to help build the factories, to run the factories. So the U.S. will actively promote immigration. You can look at this is a flyer that's inviting people to come and work in America. We will have an extensive growth between the 1860s and the 1900s. You can see it goes from 2.3 to 8.8 million immigrants. The type of immigrants that we have are African, Western European, Southern European, Eastern European, Mexican, Asian, specifically Chinese and Japanese. And the immigrants will come to America for different reasons. Some of them will come because of famine in their own country. Some of them will come because of regime change and oppression. One group of immigrants that I want to highlight here is Chinese. I'm going to be discussing them and their experience in America in a later lecture, but I thought I would just mention them here. Chinese first came to America in the 1850s during the gold rush. They came because of poverty and political upheaval. They ran restaurants and laundries. Some had businesses and were farmers. Others were railroad workers. During this time period, during U.S. industrialization, there will be a lot of violence perpetrated against them. And the U.S. government is going to pass legislation that will exclude them from the United States. That law was called the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882. And it's important because it's the first time the U.S. government will exclude a group of immigrants from the country. Let's move on to the rise of corporations. The two corporations that I'm going to discuss are U.S. Steel and Standard Oil. U.S. Steel was founded by Andrew Carnegie. U.S. Steel used a process called vertical integration, which meant the control of all parts of a business from raw materials to transportation, manufacturing, and distribution. So in other words, they were able to control pricing. If you don't have to rely on outsourcing, you can control how much you pay for something. This will make Carnegie a very rich man. There was also Standard Oil, which was founded by J.D. Rockefeller. J.D. Rockefeller, like Carnegie, used vertical integration, but he also used something called horizontal integration. And what horizontal integration was a process where a company drove out other competitors with predatory pricing, and then they would merge their competitors into a big company. So in other words, they're eliminating the competition. Standard Oil will control 90% of the nation's oil. So like Carnegie, Rockefeller is going to become a very wealthy man. So what was life like in corporations? Corporations will start to become departmentalized. So in other words, they will start to departmentalize particular jobs, such as purchasing, accounting, the machine shop, etc. Prior to that, it was not like that. It was more the owner controlled everything, or one or two people controlled everything. But now you're going to departmentalize specific roles. They will create a role called the middle manager, which means the owner is not necessarily overseeing what's going on in the corporation, that you have a go-between. They also create a role called the salesman. As you see here, women in the workplace, they were mostly low paid. Most female workers were secretaries, which at that time were considered dead-end jobs. that previously had been held by men, but they called them clerks. There was also, women also were stenographers, typists, but they were not salesmen. They were not middle managers or any type of managers. And in fact, African American women were excluded from office work. They did mostly domestic work. They did not do office work. These corporations are going to give rise to the growth of department stores and chain stores, specifically mail order catalogs, such as the one you see here. Sears and Roebuck was one of the early department stores. What I mean by department stores is that you can buy different items in one store. Prior to department stores, people bought items individually. What I mean by that is you might have the milkman, or you might go to the shoe store, but you couldn't get milk and shoes at the same store. So this changes all of that. I can remember having a Sears and Roebuck catalog store in my hometown, and every year before school, we would circle what we wanted for our school clothes, and then my mom would order it, and then it would come in this brown kind of paper package from them. So that was as late as the 70s, guys. So they were around for quite a bit. They're still around. They're just not near as robust as they used to be. Of course, having department stores creates a need for advertising, such as what you see here. This is an advertisement for Sears and Roebuck, which will create a need for what they call madmen or Madison men, advertising professionals. What was factory life like? The workforce in the factories included unskilled workers, which compared to a skilled worker was someone who basically pushed a button or pulled a lever to make the shoe instead of hand making the shoe or stitching the shoe together. The workforce included men, women, children, and immigrants. On average, 35,000 workers died each year in the factories in mine accidents, which meant the factories were very dangerous. Remember, there was no regulations on factory workers, on safety, on anything, on pay, on anything at all. Factory workers will have little to no contact with their factory owner. They would generally deal with a middle manager, which is part of something called the scientific management system, which was implemented. Time is not the worker's time anymore. In other words, prior to this, if you were a shoemaker, then you stopped working when you were done making the amount of shoes you wanted to for that day. But that is no longer the case in factories during U.S. industrialization. Okay, I want to take a look at a few sources. I provided these links to you on Canvas, but I want to take a look at them here just to give you a sense of what factory life was like during U.S. industrialization. The first one I gave you was child labor in the canning industry of Maryland. I'm just going to hit a few highlights here, and I want you to be sure to thoroughly read through the sources or to watch the sources depending on the source. But this one, this is a child labor, it's about child labor in the canning industry in 1909. And what we learn from this source is that we have young children working in this factory. We have women working in this factory. We have families working in this factory. And it describes the conditions in this particular cannery. In fact, it says that conditions are dangerous, too dangerous for children. It gives the example of having unguarded belts or wheels on the machines. Again, there is no safety regulations. These are just kind of a free-for-all, and you've got children around these unguarded belts and wheels. It discusses long hours, that there's little rest for children, that children are not being educated as a result of working in this cannery. So if the children are in the cannery working all day, then they're not being educated, which could be detrimental to them. It talks about how children weren't paid well. People weren't paid well in general in these factories, but children were paid less than adults. And they really liked children in factories because they had small hands and they could get into the machinery, into the levers and such. This document also discusses about how these companies would charge enormous prices in their company stores. The way it worked, some factories would have living quarters and shopping areas for their workers. But if you were fired from your job, that meant you also lost your living quarters. So that was one of the reasons they were willing to put up with such low pay in such terrible conditions. And even talks about how they would charge these enormous prices in the stores, so the people working in the factory wouldn't really get ahead. Right. So let me go to the next one. The other one, or another source I provided you, was something called the coil winding machines at Westinghouse. I'm just going to play this really quickly. As you'll notice in this film, that all of these women, first of all, how they're dressed in skirts and in long sleeves, and this is how women dressed during this time period. What's really important to notice is all of these machines and how close together they are. And that can be very dangerous. I mean, you could get your sleeve caught in these machines. They're very close together. You'll notice the atmosphere is very dark. It's very dimly lit, which is very difficult on the eyes. So it was very much a really tough condition for these women to be working in. All right, let me take a look at another source. This one is a 15-year-old boy operating a dangerous boring machine. Give me a second for there we go. If you look at this is a 15-year-old boy operating a dangerous boring machine. And it says, if you look at the caption up here, it says at which he said a boy recently bored half his hand off. So if you've ever worked in a factory, you know how dangerous machines can be with safety guards, let alone without them. When I worked in a factory, I worked in a factory in college, and I can remember a person getting, and I don't mean to sound gross here, but they lost their fingers. I mean, it's very dangerous. So it says, it just kind of describes, how the bore machine works. But this is a young child, and this very dangerous machine where you could lose a limb, right? Let me look at another one. This is called the Globe Cotton Mill of Augusta. All right, so this is a photograph of two women. A woman in this photograph, one of the women is pregnant, and that they work till the day of childbirth. So think about the conditions for the woman if she's pregnant. It's not only getting to the health of the woman, but it's hurting the health of an unborn child, right? And if any of you have had a child, you know that being pregnant can be very difficult, and to be in an unsafe environment like this, there was no such thing as maternity leave. That just simply did not exist during this time period. All right, so just to summarize, conditions in the factories were dangerous, they were unsafe, they were unhealthy, they received low pay and long hours. Okay, so that ends today's discussion for industrialization.